Dude, rant? Yeah, I mean, yellow.
Yo, 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 how you doing?
Chilling. What's up? What are you to talk about?
You want to do capitalism?
Sure, we can.
Do you rank them just randomly or based on your favorite?
They're just random. The
Okay.
order of the topics, they're just random.
Okay. So, could you just help me understand the baseline? Are you like a Marxist-Leninist? Are you like the idealist, anarcho-communist? Like, what type of lefty are you?
I would just be a Marxist.
Okay, so you're a Marxist.
Correct.
Interesting. So, I've never debated someone who says I'm just a Marxist. Um, so do you like reject the Soviet Union as like communism and stuff like that?
Yeah, I would say the Soviet Union never made it to communism. They were socialists who were on their way to having a socialized economy, but they never even made it that far
Okay.
because their
So
economy
I'm
was
assuming
never
you
like full
definitely reject
socialism.
China.
Do I
So you
reject
definitely
China
reject
in what way?
yeah. So like you reject Mao Zedong and Xi Jinping and that
Yeah,
the
but
Chinese
when you say
Communist Party is
reject
not
reject,
from.
what do you? Oh, like they're not actually communist? Yeah, I wouldn't call China communist. No.
Okay. Would you reject the idea that they're even trying to achieve communism, or do you think
Yeah, no,
that deep down they?
they've had so much capitalist interference that I don't know that I would call them even on the path to communism because they're like the second largest global economic superpower. So I don't know how I would call them like a socialist, even socialist. I don't know that I would call them that. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting system because it's as authoritarian as typical communist governments, but hyper capitalist. So it's pretty interesting. But the government owns most everything, so they use capitalism, but the shareholder is ultimately the government. It's a very cool hybrid system.
Yeah,
Um,
I wouldn't call shareholder meaning the government anything to do with Marxism though. I don't know if you
okay.
are. I'm just saying I wouldn't because Marx rejects the idea of a centralized state.
Yeah. And for me, that's where I kind of just draw the line and say, well, if you're like an anarchist, or if you're more in like the anarchist vein versus like the authoritarian vein, I would just say like, I think that's delusional in my book. And I'm not trying to be disrespectful to you, but like, the state will not naturally wither away. Like the
I
state's
don't
not going
I
to
don't
give up
think the
its
state will
power.
naturally wither away.
Cool. Um, so so let's just talk about the idea of like countries, because at the end of the day, I view things not from a theoretical lens, but from a very practical lens of like, hey, let's not focus so much on theory says this, Marx says this. If it's not exactly this, therefore it can't be that, and then you just play the game of well that wasn't true Marxism or that wasn't true capitalism.
Well,
So
wait,
I will
then why
be
don't we just
genuine.
define the three terms capitalism, socialism, and communism so we know what we're talking about? Because if we're talking
Sure.
about two different things, we're just going to go around in circles all day. So
Cool.
when you say
Uh,
capitalism, what do you mean?
Sure. Free exchange, so unfeathered trading between individuals, and the protection of private property.
Okay, I would just have a difference in opinion on what capitalism is then.
Okay. Could you define what are the key tenets to you?
Yeah, to me, capitalism would just be an economic system in which the means of production are privately owned, and those private owners are able to influence the government via capital and lobbying and whatnot to sort of uh, make their capitalism as open as they possibly can.
Cool. I don't disagree with your definition. I think that's a totally valid definition.
Okay.
Um, and we would agree that communism is an idealistic system that's not been ever achieved, but strives for the abolition of class, the state, and social hierarchy.
Uh, Yeah, it would just be a stateless, moneyless, classless society. I don't know that I would say it's never been achieved. I would say in modern, in like a Marxist view, it hasn't. But like if we're analyzing like communal societies based off of like indigenous tribes, they've had forms of quote unquote communism because they've had stateless, moneyless, and classless societies that were like communal. So I would say that
Yeah.
like it's not that it's never been achieved. It just hasn't been achieved like post the industrial age.
And I don't want to get too deep into this because to me it's like a very niche debate topic. But the tribes of native, Africa and North and South America prior to like European contact definitely had hierarchy systems. They
Some
had
did,
chiefs, they had
some
leaders,
didn't.
they had patriots. Uh, which tribe are you going to claim was totally without
Wait,
hierarchy?
having so this is where we'd have a disagreement. Having chiefs and like things like that would still be allowed under a communist system as long as communally they are deciding on who is their chief.
Okay, okay, fair enough. So essentially, you're saying that if there's a democratic vote, even if it's for a dictator, that makes it compliant in Marxist worldview.
If there is a democratic vote and the community decides something and there's community oversight, yeah, that would make it.
Yeah. And I would argue no tribe ever had like female enfranchisement or like things like that.
That no tribe ever had female enfranchise. You would say no indigenous tribe ever had female enfranchisement.
Not that I'm aware of.
That
But
would be an
if you could
interesting
counter
claim to
me, I'd be
make.
interested.
I don't have any off the top of my head, but I don't know that I would ever say that none did. That would be
Huh.
an interesting claim to make.
Yeah. I One thing I've at least observed is it is very the idea of like having a female leader. It happens once in a while. There's some very unique ones, but overwhelmingly like female leaders tends to be more like feudalistic systems where it's based on like hereditary rule where like okay, we have to pick the female because that's the only person that is the descendant that's still alive versus like a democratic system where they're like we're going to pick the strongest.
Okay.
So that would be my only counterpoint is, we're in a post-feminist society, so like we would probably look at the election systems of Native American tribes and be like, damn, that was pretty patriarchal or, pretty hierarchical in that sense.
It's possible.
Um, so let's go on to the initial claim that capitalism is harmful. My counterpoint to you would be you believe that communism is the only non-harmful economic system in your worldview. Is that
Nope.
true? Okay.
Nope. I don't think there's a single perfect system. I don't think that um, there are systems that are going to account for like zero harm. But when I look at capitalism and what capitalism has done both in the global south as well as in America, it becomes very clear that like capitalism, especially in the capitalism that we have now, is responsible for like millions of deaths. It's been responsible for decimation. It's been responsible for exploitation. So under this worldview, I count capitalism as a harmful thing.
Okay. But you're not so idealistic that you think that there's a perfect system, and you would agree that there are going to be certain amounts of people harmed no matter what system is used or implemented.
Yeah, I mean, when I look at communism, I expect a global revolution. So I don't know how I could expect a revolution and not expect people to get harmed. But I think
Okay.
I think what I look at it is do the positives outweigh the negatives? And I think under a
Do the
communist
ends
system they
justify
would.
the means? The classic the words before hell, the ends justify the means. I would argue that when we look at historic communist revolutions, and that we can only really look at the past, we can't really look at theory, that inherently the people would have been better off under a capitalist system from a material perspective than if they went through a communist revolution, had the industrialization under a central vanguard party, and eventually either imploded like the USSR or reformed and became a quasi-capitalist system like in the case of China. I would argue they were
Are
probably
China and
better
the
off.
USSR your only examples?
I would believe. I think it's disingenuous when we try to look at real examples instead of theory to say, "Oh, that wasn't communism."
Well, no,
Because to me, those were
I
the
am looking at like because I think we can both agree socialism would be the thing that leads to communism. So we would start with like socialist revolutions and see how those socialist revolutions would play out. But my argument would be that like anytime one of these happens, typically the United States gets involved and commits war crimes in order to stop the socialist parties from rising. So I don't know how we can judge socialism on the merits when I can't name a single. Even Russia had U.S. Interference when it comes to like the shock therapy campaigns that they ran towards the end of the USSR. So I don't know which. I don't know like what country we can say hasn't had capitalism come in to decimate a socialist system. But if you can name me one, I'll gladly look into it.
Yeah, you know, I think I'm not going to sit here like I understand geopolitics enough. Like 100%, the U.S. was funding anti-communist activities every stage, starting with the Bolshevik Revolution in 19, I think, what, 15 it kicked off, or 16.
Well, what happened?
I
It
mean, like
started well before that would have started. I mean, the earliest that I can think of would be squashing the Cuban Revolution in '89, that or 1889. That would be like the earliest that I can think of. American capitalist influence decimating another country that's trying to move to more of a socialist system.
I've never heard the argument that the freedom fighters in 1889 in Cuba were socialists. That's interesting.
Well, they were
Are you
they
talking about like
were
Jose? What was his name? Jose something Martinez.
um, I don't remember his name, but it was what I mean. I would argue that the Cuban Revolution, like, was a lead towards more of a socialist system than it was towards a capitalist system, right? And
Yeah,
That's why the U.S. like got in there early because they didn't want Cuba to nationalize any of its industries. They wanted to come in and privatize those for U.S. gain.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think we can both agree. You know, an example of U.S. imperialism, and probably one of the most clear examples of U.S. imperialism. I would argue also the Philippines. You know, that was a pretty clear one where they're like, you know what?
Well, I would say almost any
Let's
Latin American
let's
country, right? The U.S. kind of
well,
has decimated the whole of Latin America for its interests. I think we
yeah,
can both agree on
I
that.
would argue. You know, we're going to talk about Operation Condor and all that. I would argue that, you know, yeah, we played a role. We backed a faction, and we don't always back the democratic factions, but you know, I think anyone that thinks that the U.S. is here for democracy is delusional.
Yeah,
And I think
this would
people,
just go to my point, right? Like these the backings that we're doing, and we're backing specifically in these areas because we want to continue with the privatized ownership of these industries, right? That's why we attacked Salvador Allende. That's why we tried to assassinate Fidel Castro like 200 plus times. Like it would appear that the U.S. typically doesn't care whether or not. Or let me phrase it this way: it would appear that capitalism, right? Because I would refer to this as the capitalism that we had talked about when I told you what I view capitalism as. It would appear that capitalism doesn't has a vested interest in violently squashing these revolutions when they pop up, whether or not these revolutions are democratically backed by the people or not.
yeah. So one thing I just want to give as a counterpoint, you might brush under, is like a token example. But you know, would you agree with me that the U.S. is pretty much the embodiment of global capitalism? Like we're the vanguard party, so to speak, of global capitalism, liberal democracy.
Yeah, yeah, probably.
Um, the U.S. has been willing to work with communist groups in the case of Iraq. So we actively supplied and weaponized the Kurds, who were openly communist, because we viewed the Islamist fundamentalist as more of a threat than the communists. So I would say that as a counterpoint of we will crush every workers' revolution.
I mean, sure, but we can just go to like what we did in Iran, which is I would say is us just doing the same thing, right? Like so, yeah, we there may be instances where like our greater interests lie in, and I would say Iraq, our greater interest didn't lie in fighting with the communists; it lied with trying to receive crude oil. So I would say if our interests align, more capital will back whoever, right, in order to get that. That's why during the Cuban Revolution where they broke away from Spain, we backed Cuba because we said it's a positive for us because we thought we would be able to then have a stronghold over Cuba forever, even though we only kept that stronghold for about 50 years. So yeah, I'd say that
Yeah.
if there are greater interests, if there's a greater capital incentive, we're gonna back whoever we can in order to receive that capital incentive.
Absolutely. And that's where I would just say, like, money is not hyper idealistic. Another great counterpoint I give to people is we were more than happy to invest alongside the Chinese Communist Party, work inside, a very authoritarian left-wing government because, they made some concessions that were capital friendly. And we knew that they had something that we couldn't find anywhere else. That's kind of the beauty of capitalism is we can do business with people that historically are our enemies. We look at Joe Biden, and it's not the best example, but it was a short-term example. We lift the sanctions on Venezuela because we said, you know what, we fucking hate the Russians more than we hate the communists in Venezuela. So we're going to lift the sanctions and try to bring in Venezuelan oil to say F you to Russia. Our interests are shifting, Enemies one day, friends the next.
Sure, I don't think this is necessarily a good thing, right? Like if we're gonna look at the prompt, which is capitalism is harmful, I would say if capitalism is willing to bomb the shit out of somebody one day and the next pretend to be their allies for some greater net benefit to themselves while screwing over these other countries, because typically that's what happens is we screw over the smaller countries. I would say that just goes to show that capitalism is still harmful, right? I don't know how I would phrase that as not harm.
Yeah, I think I would say capitalists are predictable. We go to where the best deal is, and we're willing to deal with certain people that historically we're not if we get enough concessions. To me, that is a better way to run foreign relations. To me, a very idealistic or very dogmatic way of viewing foreign relations is going to create a net negative for the society of the people living in them. The main example I would give is the USSR essentially having ideology guide all foreign relations, and the idea that, hey, we're going to continue to subsidize all these countries with favorable trade deals, even though it creates a net drain on our society.
Wait,
It's not
those weren't
viable.
favorable. Our trade deals have consistently been unfavorable. That's why most of these countries are moving to China to execute further trade deals and putting us out of them, because we introduced trade deals that had increasingly high interest rates, terrible terms for a lot of these countries that were just getting out of economic economic downfalls that we started. So I would argue
So,
that we're setting up trade deals that benefit us, but they don't benefit the other countries.
so just to go back one step, you misinterpreted what I said.
Okay.
I was referencing the fact that the USSR, when they had everything run by ideology, when it came to trade relations and foreign relations, they would create trade relations that were not positive for the USSR, that were unprofitable, simply because of ideology, the idea of like socialist brotherhood, and the idea of like, hey, we're just going to pay these people to be loyal to us, even if it doesn't provide mutual benefit. And to me, that contributed to the end of their economic power. Like, that was what I've learned studying the collapse of the USSR, is that they were more interested in ideological purity than economic reality. And that furloughed into both foreign relations and trade relations with other countries.
Sure,
Versus
but how does this
capitalism, where it's very
address
much...
how does this address the harm perpetrated by capitalism? I feel like it doesn't. I feel
Sure.
like it's mostly a whataboutism, which I feel like most people do when it comes to like that first prompt is, well, capitalism's not harmful because look at what all these other countries do, but that doesn't mitigate the harm that capitalism is doing.
Sure. To give you a little bit of like my moral code, I'm a survivalist in the sense of I believe you do what it takes to survive, and that the system of what's right versus what's wrong is what system actually perpetuates and is stable. Because to me, the end goal of any political system or economic system is stability and peace. So I would argue that under communist frameworks, having a super ideological lens towards foreign relations inherently creates instability, while under capitalism, we're much more willing to work with people historically we probably wouldn't be because it's advantageous. And that survival mechanism of, hey, I might not like you, I might not like what you represent ideologically, but we both benefit from it, so I'm going to do it. I think that's a good way to conduct foreign relations.
Wait, I would just argue this doesn't mitigate the harm caused by capitalism at all, right? This just goes to show that capitalism is able to engage in that harm. Like it's able to very easily commit this harm because capitalism doesn't need to agree with you. Capitalism doesn't need to agree with you at all. All capitalism has to do is destabilize you to the point where you're going to go with the capitalist deal because you have no other option. Right? Like this is how we've been conducting ourselves in Latin America for forever, right? Since the late 1800s. So it would appear that it's not about, how do I want to phrase this? Whether or not you're ideologically inclined to agree with the country you're working with, the greater issue is that capitalism will like quite literally kill in order to get these other countries to agree with them. So I still feel like the prompt isn't necessarily being addressed.
Yeah. So let's go with the earlier thing of essentially it's like a hostage situation in the sense of we either sign the deal or we kill you, right? That's a very classic left-wing argument towards U.S. economic policy and against U.S. hegemony. One thing that I would like to point out, though, is there absolutely are countries that said, fuck you, fuck the capitalists, fuck the imperialists, we're going to do it our own way. And, capitalism is not God. They can be defeated, and they have been multiple times. We look at the Taliban, we look at the Vietnamese, we look at the Cubans. Capitalism, yes, will preserve its own interests, and it will invest money in war when necessary. But if you have the power and you have the resources and you have enough foreign backing, you can oppose the U.S. I mean, many countries actually
opposing the U.S. doesn't mean that there's not harm, right? Like let's take Vietnam for example. There was 360,000 civilian deaths brought about by Vietnam saying we don't want to be beholden to U.S. capitalism, right? That's harm, right? If this is a sovereign nation that's able to make sovereign choices, we go in there and destroy those sovereign choices only on the basis of we don't like communism, we don't want these countries to make their decisions. Like when it comes to like we can even look further when it came to Chile, right? Literally, Henry Kissinger said, hold on, let me pull the quote. He said, "I don't see why we need to stand idly by and watch a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its own people." To which Nixon said, "Yup, do whatever it takes to stop Allende from maintaining power." And so they bombed the hell out of the palace and caused him to kill himself. So it just seems like, yeah, you can say, I'm going to do my own thing, but America's going to come in and say, no, you're not. You're going to do what we tell you to do if your country is smaller than ours.
Sure. The counterpoint I would say to that is you agree with me that Chile was a democratic system prior to Pinochet?
Yes, they democratically elected Allende, and he had overwhelming support.
And
I think the estimates are 70% support for Allende, if not more.
Yeah, and same thing with Maduro. Same thing with not Maduro, Chavez. I apologize. He was democratically elected. Mm-hmm. The main problem I would argue is that, generally speaking, I have not seen very far left political parties give up political power once they have it. And that eventually the end goal of many far left ideologies is to abolish democracy and to establish the vanguard party. And that is going to create political instability to transition from a democracy to an authoritarian regime. And it's acceptable for the US government to back elements that are reactionary against a transformation from a democracy to an authoritarian regime.
Wait, can you... So your claim is, just so that I have it understood here, that it's important for the U.S. to install authoritarian regimes to prevent authoritarian regimes? I don't know how that... I don't know how that...
I from a more pragmatic perspective, I would say that democracy is something that's very fragile. Would you agree with me?
Uh, I guess maybe it depends.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know that that's a yes or no agreement. Feel like that would have a more nuanced answer to it.
Sure. I'm just trying to establish baselines, and where I lose you, you can disagree. But I just want to get the baseline of like inherently, like democracy is not something people just naturally want. Like that's a big qualm I have with like U.S. foreign policy and like U.S. hypocrisy is the idea that we can just instill democracies and people will inherently want it. We see like over
That's
and
because
over
I
again.
don't think the U.S. instills democracies. I think they instill fascism, because a democracy almost always, whenever a democracy votes against the U.S., they come in like we were talking about. They came in and said, "Yo, we're gonna back Pinochet and we're gonna destroy Allende." Right? They didn't care about democracy then. All they cared about was maintaining control over the copper industry in Chile.
Mhm. Yeah, 100%. The other thing I would just say is that democracies can backslide. It's very easy for democracies to become authoritarian regimes. And the question becomes, do you want a left-wing authoritarian or a right-wing authoritarian? And the ideal state is a democracy. We strive for democracies. But at the end of the day, we will always push for right-wing authoritarian regimes over a left-wing authoritarian regime when that threat occurs. But the ideal state is a democracy. And that's why you see the boot got lifted off Latin America, and now you have social democratic parties. You have socialist parties that are actually winning a lot of elections in Latin America, but they're still functioning democracies. Great counterpoint, though, Venezuela, the lefties took power and then they purged everyone. But that's, to me, that was an oversight.
Yeah, what I would just say is I don't know that this necessarily is holding true, right? Like we Cuba still has overwhelming majority support for the policies of Castro. They still overwhelming, and we can see that those policies benefited Cuba when it comes to looking at like their literacy rate went to 100%. They have a higher life expectancy than the U.S. and they have a lower infant mortality rate, and they have a higher doctor per capita. Right? They created 5 COVID vaccines before we created one, and their country like basically handled the virus way better than we ever did, right? Whether or not you agree with the COVID stuff or not. So it would seem that like from all this, what's the reason we still have Cuba under blockade and embargo to this day, to the point where Biden strengthened it? What would be our reason if we're saying that democracy is what's important? These are people that are democratically keeping these policies in play in this political party in power, but we don't care about that. We only care that Cuba is a really good source of resources for us, and we've wanted those resources since we lost them in the 50s.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought up Cuba. So just so I understand your rhetoric, you're saying that Cuba is a democracy. Is that correct?
Yeah, when they elected Castro, he had like the lowest numbers we as America could find was 50% approval, and that was on the low end.
Okay, you're talking about essentially popularity polls within the essentially Cuban government. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, Cuba purged anyone that was anti-government. I mean, that's why we have Miami. The biggest thing also with Cuba is it's a one-party dictatorship. So it just, to me,
Yes, but
is the biggest,
socialism
mental.
calls for a dictatorship. That's the whole thing. It's a dictatorship of the proletariat. It's the dictatorship of the working
Yeah.
class.
And in all due respect, I think that's like the worst brainwashing I've ever heard in my life. But let's operate from there. The idea that abolishing all political parties is democracy is like 1984 level mental gymnastics for myself personally.
Okay? So when I'm talking about democracy, how did like Castro didn't gain power without the support of the Cuban people, right?
Well, he took it violently, but there was a violent
Well,
dictatorship prior to him. So
yeah,
I'm
he
not going
kind
to
of had
critique him
to. He
on
kind of had
that.
to take it violently,
Yeah,
right?
I'm not going to critique him on that.
And if we're going to talk about like the expungel of the Cuban people like into America, it's because America from like the minute Castro took power has decimated the Cuban economy. That was America's whole point. Like our whole plan was to make Cubans poor, hungry, and starving so they would revolt against Castro. It just didn't work. But a lot of them did leave because of, again, U.S. imperialism. So I don't know. It just, for me, it feels like we keep running back to the same thing, which is U.S. capital engaging in these harmful practices.
Yeah, and I think I'm not going to sit here and say like, oh, that's not true. I think it's very much like when you study geopolitics, you understand that there's no saints when it comes to geopolitics. There's only just interests, and people will do whatever it takes to advance their interests. And that's why I don't sit here and say like, oh, you're a terrible person, or the USSR is terrible, or Cuba's terrible. Those people are protecting their interests, and they're doing what they think is best. But there is going to be a grand conflict because some interests cannot align. I would just argue that capitalists are probably one of the best systems of getting people that have a bunch of very dispersed interests and a lot of different interests to all work together, to all trade, to all essentially build interdependence and economic dependence on each other, even if we have different interests. And, personally for me, I'm sad to see how militant we've come to our historic adversaries. I don't like the idea of like Russian sanctions and decoupling from China, even though these are very essentially the polar opposites of U.S. interests. I like the idea of essentially a unified global order where we're all interdependent, because to me,
I understand that. I would just say that like it's not an interdependency because of shared mutual interests. It's an interdependency because America spends $1 trillion a year in order to maintain its foothold on these smaller regions, whether that be through violent means or not. And like I said, and I'm assuming you would agree, we can look at the Iraq War as like a modern example of this, right? There were no weapons of mass destruction. Every single source has shown that. Yet we still went in the veins of getting a foothold in the Middle East. I mean, we can look at Israel. Israel's been considered a client state of us since the 80s. We've put money into Israel because it maintains our interest in that area. Again, it just seems like when it comes to the geopolitical side, capitalism isn't existing as a way for everybody to like hold hands and like we go, okay, we are all commonly shared in this goal. No, it's the US has a goal, and if either you get on board with that goal or we destroy your country and kill your citizens.
Yeah, essentially it's carrot and stick democracy, diplomacy, so to speak. The carrot is economic growth, intertrade, we all get wealthier, and the stick is if you don't want it, we're gonna fucking, kill you. And that's the unfortunate reality of geopolitics. Ideally, everything's driven by the carrot, but we see over and over again the stick comes out, and that's why we actively are sending $250 billion to Ukraine, we're sending $50 billion to Israel, and Iran's about to get a nuclear weapon. It's a very interesting time for geopolitics, but I would argue that a global order under capitalism is probably our best bet of creating maybe not a world government, but a stable world. To me, some systems just cannot coexist. And I don't like the idea of essentially the second world versus the first world. And these people won't trade, their interests will never align, and they'll always be adversarial, whether they're trying to undermine each other with propaganda or supplying weapons to their enemies. I don't like that type of world order. I want a very stable world order with rules, regulations, fair trade, and self-determination, personally.
And I would just argue that if that stable world order comes off the backs of millions of people dying, I don't think that it's a good world order. I think it's a world order ruled about by fear of death.
Yeah, I think anyone that has a heart isn't going to sit here and say like poverty is a good thing or that poverty is by design.
But I'm not even just talking about poverty, right? We're just talking about like the unfettered foot of American imperialism, right? Like that's like what I would be talking about if we're looking at like how the world maintains its order, quote unquote. Especially how it maintains its order on U.S. We've gone over this. The U.S. is willing and has shown that it's willing to kill upwards of millions of people as long as their interests remain intact.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should be realistic in the sense of, you know, no matter any world contender or essentially aspiring world power is going to essentially make decisions that end millions of lives but also create millions of lives. Like that's one of the main problems with being like a hegemon or any sort of world power is that your decisions that you make and the policies and the beliefs that you have will either create millions of lives or end millions of lives. And I would just argue that in the grand scheme of things, the capitalist system will create way more lives, way more wealth, and way more positive things than it will create in waste, destruction, and death.
But wait,
You know, I'm
what does
not
it
saying
matter if it's creating that wealth if that wealth isn't shared, right? Like in the last 2 years, 63% of all global wealth has gone to 1% of people. What does it matter if that wealth is being generated if that wealth isn't being given to the actual people that are earning the wealth or the actual people that are putting in the labor to make the wealth? Right? What do I care if Elon Musk gets more money? That doesn't really do anything for the greater good. That just does everything for like Elon Musk.
Yeah. So I'm glad you brought this up. I love these statistics. And the problem with a lot of the wealth statistics that are quoted by the far left, or I would say you're far left. So would you reject that label?
I mean, I'm a communist, so.
Yeah, okay. There's nothing more left. The main argument I would say is look at this metric, the median household income in the United States. And I know you're going to say global south, global south. We can look at global median household income and we can see adjusted for inflation, we're continuing to grow. Granted, it's been stagnant since COVID because, we've decoupled and we're against, free trade now. But I would argue material conditions are improving quite drastically across the world. And frankly, the Chinese are leading the way in terms of going from, $1,000 per person per year in GDP capita to 10,000. So hats off to the Chinese development model.
I would just look at the global household income. It's 12,000. It's 12,000 per year. I don't think that's a good number.
But compared to 100 years ago,
Well, yeah, anything compared to 100 years ago is going to look all kind of favorably, right? Like, I don't see that as a way to like gauge whether global capitalism is working, right? Like all the numbers rose, so whether or not this number rose or not doesn't really show anything, right? But if that number is only rising, right, because we're killing anybody that we think is a threat to that number, I don't necessarily know that that's a good thing. I would just argue that this is again this system sort of breaking in within itself, right?
Yeah, and I would just argue that we can essentially gauge the success of global capitalism by measuring wealth statistics, income statistics, and population. And, to me, you could argue, oh, with technology, we could have achieved under socialism, but...
And actually, really quickly, according to, I'm sorry, just because I was looking at this, according to it, the median per capita household income is only $2,000. That's even lower.
But I'm assuming that includes children, probably, right?
I don't know that children would be included under a per capita income model. I mean, maybe if they're working, if they're in countries where they're working.
Well, no, I'm just saying so you agree with me, like 12,000 that's the number I saw for like global median household income.
Well, yeah, but I think that's because these numbers would be skewed if we're not looking per capita, right? They would be skewed because we're looking at if we're looking at average worldwide income, the U.S., China, India, these countries, these larger countries are going to skew all of those data if we're just looking at like regular averages. But if we're looking at per capita, we're going to get a much clearer number of how much people are making relative to the population size of those countries.
Yeah, and the thing that I would say, especially when we're looking at globally, we are very young as a species. Like when you look at like the world demographic pyramid, we have a shit ton of young people. Like there is way more kids, and like the under 18 is the biggest demographic, or essentially biggest generation. So like the current child generation is the biggest because we're about to hit the peak of global population. Eventually it's going to flatten out because we're going to essentially like peak at 10 billion. But we have a shit ton of kids. Like China is getting old, but India and Africa, oh my God, they are breaming with children. Like they are going to be the future of economic growth. I mean,
Yeah, but
India, I think,
those children aren't being counted here because even when I look up here, the median figures based on responses are from adults in each country, not from kids. So we're only looking at adults in those numbers when we're looking at the income per capita.
And are you saying the average is 2,000 or the median is 2,000?
Well, the median per capita income. That's what you had said originally was median. We can look at the mean if you'd like. We can look at the average, but I think median gives us kind of a better number
I
because
think
we can see
median's
like
more
what's
fair.
yeah, because we can see like directly in the middle. And I would say like if the median is only 2,000, that doesn't bode well, right? If like our middle point is just 2,000.
Yeah. So one thing I find really fascinating that I was researching, because I do like development economics. You know, I think it's a very interesting field of debate because essentially it's just capitalists being like, okay, how do we actually go from like low income countries to medium income? And the big question within development economics is how do we go from median to essentially like high class living? And that's the current big thing within development economics, and I would say is the most valid critique of capitalism is there's only so much room at the top, so to speak. So on that question of the median per capita income is at $2,000, and to you that's totally unacceptable. And by American standards,
yeah, the worldwide median per capita is $2,920.
okay, and I would just argue that statistic is probably including the 3 billion people that are probably under the age of 18 in that statistic. So essentially,
No,
3
like I
billion
said,
have zero.
they clarify here. The median figures are based on responses from adults in each country.
Wow. I'll look into that. So what's the source?
This
I'm
is
curious.
this is a Gallup poll, so this is Gallup.
Okay. Huh. I wonder how they're able to derive the median household income at 13,000 if the median income is 2,000. You know what I mean? That just doesn't seem
Well,
right.
I think when they're looking at what they're doing is they're looking at the median worldwide, and then they look at the median per capita. So the median, actually, Gallup says the median is only about 9,733. But you're obviously going to have differences in these numbers depending on who's doing the poll and the way they're doing the poll. But it still seems like, you know, these numbers are still fairly low. I mean, even if it's risen since Gallup's done the poll, those numbers are still fairly low numbers. And per capita seems to be the best way we're going to look at finding those. So I can try to find, even this one. This is from Zippia research, which is income stats. Even Zippia puts the median per capita worldwide at 2,920, and this is as of 2023. So it seems like just going back
Wait,
to
did you say that was a 2003 poll?
2023.
Okay, sorry.
So just going back to, wealth generation being a good thing. I don't think wealth generation matters if like the bulk of people aren't seeing that wealth generation. Like if we're generating all this wealth, because what was it? I think we generated like over at like, what was the worldwide global wealth generation in 2023? It was a fucking lot.
I think like global wealth is at 300 trillion, but spot check me on that.
I can pull it up. But I mean, if we're pulling 629 trillion, or no, I'm sorry, that's what we expect it to be by 2027. Most recent would be, Jesus Christ, can someone give me a direct number and not just projections of 2027 numbers? I don't mind going off of what you said, which is you said about 300 trillion. I don't mind even using that number. What I would just say is, if we're globally generating this wealth and the bulk of the globe is not seeing that wealth, I don't necessarily think that wealth creation is inherently a good thing, because we could have not generated that wealth, right? We could have stopped well before that wealth was generated, and we would have still seen the same thing. So let me just do the math real quick. What's 63% of 300 trillion?
Well, it's not that extreme. The 1% does not own 63% of the wealth. They control about a quarter.
I mean,
If you
like I
look at
said,
essentially
these are the numbers that I'm showing between 2019 and 2021. That 63% of all new wealth generated. Not that they control like all the wealth, but of all the new wealth that we generated in that period, it went to
oh,
1% of people.
yeah, I'll concede to you that COVID is was definitely unequal in terms of its wealth distribution, and I would argue that actually COVID destroyed wealth. Like if we look at it, global wealth declined and has not recovered, inflation adjusted since COVID. Like we're actually in a worse material condition from a global perspective than we were prior to COVID.
Sure, but I would be shocked to see if those numbers changed in a post world COVID world, and to see what those numbers were in a pre COVID world, because 2019 was pre COVID, right? We hadn't been hit with we weren't hit with the wave of COVID lockdowns and shutdowns till about March of 2020.
Yeah, so one thing that I just want to encourage whenever we start talking about like wealth distribution and, equitable distribution of wealth, I would just encourage us to view things from the perspective of income versus wealth. Because the income perspective is how most people actually generate money, because most people actually have zero wealth in this world. I think it's something along the lines of like 30 to 40% of the world has no net worth. But
Well, so I
the
mean,
world
I went
does
back to
create
wealth because
wages.
I felt like we had covered income, right? We covered that when we're looking income wise per capita, people aren't even earning over $2,000 per income. I don't know if that's yearly or whatever it is, but either way,
Yeah,
um,
it's probably yearly. I would just the numbers I saw were closer to around 11,000 per household. And one other metric that I would encourage you to look at is just like what percentage of people are living in extreme poverty. So
well, yeah,
I'm sure you've heard that argument.
I'm showing the 11. I'm showing about 12,000, just the median income, right? But that doesn't really tell us a whole lot. Like we said earlier, the per capita is going to give us that broader number. And per capita, it seems like most people are still living in abject poverty around the world. So this idea that like capitalism grows people out of this poverty doesn't seem to be a reality. It seems to actually be that capitalism is forcing people to stay in this poverty so that the money can go to other people.
Okay, I'm glad you brought that up. To counteract that point, I would encourage you to look at what percentage of the population lives in extreme poverty, which is generally defined as inflation adjusted, I believe, less than $2.50 a day, which is around $4,000 a year. And you'll see that, we went from prior to the Industrial Revolution at 95% of us living in extreme poverty to, I believe, like 25% live in extreme poverty today?
Yeah, I would just argue with those numbers, right? I would argue with specifically because when we look at global poverty numbers, we look at it specifically from the World Bank. I would argue with the World Bank's assertion that $2.15 a day, anything over that is not global poverty. I would just argue against
Yeah.
that. I think it's just kind of silly to say that like, oh, if you make 216, you're no longer living in abject poverty, right? This just doesn't really gel with like what we actually see in these countries when we look at these countries where they're making that little, right? We are seeing people who are living in like mountainous areas who work day in and day out to have like $5 in their take home, like do backbreaking labor to come home with $5 to live in homes where they don't have adequate plumbing, adequate electricity, adequate these, but because they have homes, because they have food on the table, we're classifying these situations as like, well, they're not in abject poverty. But I just think that this isn't the way we would look at it. We should be looking at the whole of the situation, not just like, do they make a specific amount of money?
Yeah. So the only counterpoint I would say to that is I think anyone on this phone call would agree, like $2.50 is far from luxury and most people would consider that poverty. But I say, isn't it crazy to think that 95 or 90% of us prior to the beginning of industrial capitalism were living that way, below $2.50 a day? Like that, to me, makes me so appreciative
Well, yeah,
of
but
how much.
cost of living was lower than that back then, right? Like pre
That's what I'm trying
global
to communicate.
capitalism would be what, the pre-industrial age. Like you didn't need more than that. Now you do because of like global inflation.
But
Whatever reasons we want to claim for global inflation. So I don't know that sure, it's great that people are surviving on that. But I don't want a world where half of or over half of the global population has to just survive, right? I like a world where these people are able to not only survive but thrive.
Yeah, and same here. You know what I mean? Like, I don't like the idea of consumers that have no disposable income and can only buy grain. You know what I mean? Like, that's a terrible, even from like a capitalist perspective, super poor people are a terrible idea because they can't consume anything, they can't buy anything, and they can't even be healthy enough to work and create things. You know, no one wants poverty.
Well,
Like, the end goal of any
argue
economic system.
no 100%, but I would just argue that America specifically doesn't want them to consume, right? At least not at least they're like countries like Latin America aren't our target audience for like production. Like, they're not the people we want to sell to. We're keeping them in poverty so that they have to work cheaper, so that way we can exploit the labor that they are forced upon, because we've not only caused these countries into nationwide recessions, we then use that nationwide recession to farm out their labor. It just seems like it's, again, this cycle of capitalism being incredibly harmful when it comes to just the way it's treated in like any country that's not considered a quote unquote first world country.
Yeah, so one that I always want to bring up whenever we talk about the idea of like why you people, when you say we purposely keep them in poverty so they work cheap, that's where I really draw the line, and I say, you know, that's very disingenuous. That it's some sort of like from the top down, let's keep them poor because we want people to work for $2 an hour. The capitalist doesn't care if they pay them $2 an hour or if he pays them $40 an hour. All the capitalist cares about is how productive the worker is.
Oh wait, I fully disagree with this. I think it's very clear that the capitalist cares about maximizing profits at whatever way they can do it. Just look at what's going on in the Congo right now. Like, we are actively backing the fascist rule in the Congo because those fascist leaders are not only getting kickbacks from us, but those fascist leaders are then imposing this workforce on the labor in that country, so that way we can get the materials we need to make phones and whatever other electronics we want on the cheap. We don't care what happens to the people of the Congo. All we care about is these resources.
I'm really glad you brought up the Congo. So one thing that's really, I think, gets missed a lot in these conversations with development economics and, you know, the third world and the global south and all that, is we would prefer much more productive minds that were not driven by human labor. Like, from a capitalist perspective, industrial minds with infrastructure and massive amounts of machinery are the ideal state because we can extract more, increase supply, and then drive down the cost of cobalt. The problem with the Congo is there's zero stability in that region, and you could say, oh, it's your fault it's not stable. But the reality of the situation, there is no stability, there is no central authority, there is no infrastructure, and, you know, that is actually inefficient. The ideal scenario would be that we found cobalt in Wyoming and we deploy a couple $100 million worth of mining equipment and we just source it domestically. Like, that is the end goal of capitalism, is a very capital intensive industry where the workers get paid well. It's very capital intensive and the workers produce more. The end goal of capitalism is more production. And you can talk about the environmental concern, but we want production.
I don't disagree that capitalism wants an expansion of production. I don't disagree with this at all. I think it's one of the things that I think is a net negative about capitalism, is that they want that expansion. But I think it's been shown time and time again that we're willing to do this expansion at the net negative of others. Like, whether we can talk about the Congo, we can even look at what we did in Cuba. When we basically took over most of their important industries and left their population decimated because we needed it to be decimated. So for instance, in Cuba, we prior to the expulsion of the U.S., right, back when the U.S. was occupying Cuba, only 3% of Cubans owned the farms they worked on. We bought up the rest. Only 3% owned that land. over half of their country was illiterate, right? And their life expectancy had dropped to like 59, right? And this was all purposeful. This was all and like we can still see the documents that the U.S. drew up about these plans. This was purposeful to keep them. I don't want to use the word subservient, but kind of do, right? They thought that if they left these people poor, if they left these people illiterate, that they wouldn't revolt up against them. They just weren't expecting Castro.
Yeah. And, one thing I want to be very clear here is, the geopolitics of the 1940s and, compared to the geopolitics of today are very different. I think everyone, even on the hyper-capitalist side, agrees that, public education, some form of government subsidies for healthcare are worth it, in the sense that, yeah, the government does provide a function, and healthcare and education are worthy investments. Like, I don't see many people that, I consider myself hyper-capitalist, and I argue, like, yeah, make sure people can read, yeah, make sure people don't die from treatable diseases that cost 50 cents to cure. That's just a net negative. We don't want to have disabled workers. We don't want sick workers. We want workers that can read. Like, these are all positive attributes we should strive for, and the state plays a very important role in that. And you see that even with, like, the uber billionaires, providing things like malaria shots or, trying to reform public education systems. All I'm trying to say is, like, you don't have a monopoly on social development from a healthcare and education perspective.
Sure, but to counter that, I would just say we absolutely want people sick because we commodified medicine. We absolutely want people to be sick because it benefits the health insurance industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and the like hospital industry. And we've seen this time and time again, right? There's a reason why insulin costs $900 here, but costs like $30 in another country, right? They don't care. And to couple that with the fact that we put incentives on farmers to make grains because we're getting paid by these companies that make the sugar-induced foods that lead to people getting type 2 diabetes, right? It's a cycle. So I would just argue it's very clear that at least like we're talking about American capitalism 100% wants to keep its people sick, at least sick enough that they can work, while also having to pay for healthcare.
I'm so glad you brought up healthcare, man. My little brother does healthcare management consulting, and he works both on the provider side and the insurance side. And it's a lot more nuanced. You are 100%. There are elements within the healthcare system that are very extractive, where essentially they want to kill you. You know what I mean? They got the patent. They know they control the best quality medicine, and they set the price. But believe it or not, the insurance companies are generally on the side of the consumer because the cheaper they can get the medicine and the cheaper they can provide service, the bigger their profits.
I don't disagree in that regard. I also worked insurance, right? But I wouldn't blame one specific of these industries on healthcare being the way it is. I would say it's a combination of insurance, because we have to look at insurance bloat, right? It's what 70% of what you pay for insurance is just administrative cost. And we've seen that it's just administrative bloat because other countries don't have the same bloat as that we do on our insurance. And again, I've worked in insurance. I've literally seen the statements, and I've seen the bloat that is there, right? It's a mix of that. It's a mix of hospitals recognizing that they can charge whatever they want because insurances will pay it. And then it's a recognition of pharmaceutical companies doing the same thing, recognizing that, hey, if we just treat the disease as opposed to curing the disease, insurance companies will pay whatever we want. And then we can even sell our specific drugs to hospitals with incentives. So then hospitals will push our drugs instead of pushing the other ones. It's just, like I said, it's just global. It's American specific capitalism that's working again in the way to prioritize profit over people.
So one thing that I just want to push on that I think is really interesting about healthcare is the movement where the insurance companies are buying the providers because they realize how much they're getting essentially imposed by the providers. And that we are essentially moving towards this idea of maybe the ideal market is a monopoly. where even if it's like a privatized monopoly where insurance also owns the provider and they also own the pharmaceutical companies, that way they can control the pricing on these drugs that people need. I would argue that, when you try to push for like a monopoly-based system, whether it's a government monopoly or a private monopoly, you're going to suffer in a certain way. Yeah, you can lower the prices, but you're going to increase the wait times. That's always been the contradiction when it comes to essentially price ceilings and putting price controls in place is, yes, you can lower the price, but guess what? People will stop supplying it. And, you're going to have longer wait times because less people want to become doctors, less people want to put money into cutting R&D research, less people want to get into the industry if they put a ceiling on the price.
Sure. Then we would just be in agreement on the nationalization of healthcare. I mean, I don't mind that. I'm for like the nationalization of healthcare. I'm for the nationalization of really anything that is human or necessary for humans to live. But we've been talking for like an hour. My friend Bell does want to pop up if they're still here and ask. I think they might have left actually. They were just
Hey,
here.
thanks
They
for
wanted to
having
ask
me
a
on,
question,
though.
but
You're
yeah,
a good guy.
it's been like an hour, so I just want to move on to the next person. But yeah, no, if feel free to come back if you want to ever continue the discussion.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
No problem.